Good evening, everyone. The time is 6 o'clock, and I think it'd be good for us to get started. Today marks the University of Evansville's 38th celebration of the Dr. Martin Luther King Legacy and Lectureship. It's also the 18th annual Mays Martin Luther King Lectureship. And my name is Dr. Rob Shelby. I am the Chief Diversity Officer here at the university, and I'm glad that you are here. It's my pleasure to welcome each of you this evening. It's also my pleasure to see so many distinguished guests, Mayor Winicky, Pres P, and all of you are honored guests because you're here. And thank you for making that decision to be here tonight. I would be remiss if I did not mention each of the members of the Martin Luther King Jr. Program Committee: Julie Bryant, Leara Carter, Abigail Catania, Dr. Lisa Marie Hale, Arthur Hurst, Melissa Moorhead Moore, Dr. Yolanda Obaze, Professor Sarah Smith, and Michael Tessier. The theme of this year's celebration and observation of Dr. King is unrelenting faith. Faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see, the evidence of things not seen. Being sure, having hope, being certain. Reverend King, while imperfect, had faith that the way things were did not mean that's how things ought to be. And it did not mean that's how things will be in the future. How can a person have such confidence? How can anyone stay the course in the face of tremendous pressure to conform? In Dr. King's case, his faith was not in an idea or an ideology. His faith was in a person, and that person was God. You see, his theology, his understanding of God, informed his anthropology, the things that make us human. It also informed his epistemology, how we understand knowledge and how we learn. It shaped his sociology, how we relate to other people. It impacted his psychology, how the mind affects our behavior. The core of Dr. King's thoughts, actions, ideas, and convictions emanated from his central faith in God. It is the unwavering faith that we focus on this year. Marian Wright Edelman, the founder of the Children's Defense Fund and Dr. King's good friend, said, "I was impressed with his leadership, but I think I was impressed even more by the fact that he was an adult and he was not afraid to speak about his uncertainties and his fears." And it is this quote that she actually says that has been attributed to Dr. King, that faith is taking the first step even when you cannot see the whole staircase. At this time, let's welcome the Honorable Mayor Lloyd Winicky to the stage.
Thank you, Rob, and good evening. Appreciate you being out on such a frigid, wintry night. I think it's really appropriate that the theme of the night is unrelenting faith. Dr. King once said that in the quiet recesses of his heart, he was fundamentally a clergyman, a Baptist preacher. And as Rob just told us, it was his deep and abiding love for his God that gave him the vision and the drive to fight discrimination all around the world. While your city and your governments and your institutions carve out today to honor Dr. King and programs like this, It's incumbent on all of us, not just our institutions, to keep the fight and the dream of Dr. King alive, not just on this day, but year-round. Thank you for believing in the dream. Thank you for being in the fight, and thanks for being here tonight.
Arthur, if you'll make your way up to the stage. Please welcome second-year sports communication student and member of the Fellow Scholars Program and the Martin Luther King Day Committee, Arthur Hurst.
Good evening, everyone. I'd like to say thank you again for gathering here tonight, and thank you, the committee, for presenting me with this opportunity to introduce our speaker tonight. A historian of religion in the 20th century, Dr. Lerone A. Martin is the incoming faculty director for the Martin Luther King Jr. Research and Education Institute at Stanford University, where he also teaches in the Department of Religious Studies. He is the former director of American Cultural Studies, associate professor of religion and politics in the John C. Danforth Center on Religion and Politics, and associate professor of African American Studies at Washington University in St. Louis. His books and scholarship provide critical context for the forces of religion, politics, and race that have shaped the contemporary American political and social landscape. Martin is the author of the award-winning Preaching on Wax, the phonograph and the making of modern African-American religion, which tracks the role of the phonograph in the shaping of African-American religion, culture, and politics during the first half of the 20th century. The book was the 2015 recipient of the prestigious Frank S. and Elizabeth D. Brewer Prize for Outstanding Scholarship in Religious History by a first-time author from the American Society of Church History. A tight, well-conceived narrative, Preaching on Wax demonstrates persuasively how religious, commercial, and technological forces came together in the making of modern African-American Christianity. Most important, perhaps, is crisp, accessible prose makes it a pleasure to read. Having witnessed firsthand the Bureau's engagement with faith communities during the protests in 2014 Ferguson, Missouri, Martin was inspired to write the forthcoming The Gospel of J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI in the making of white evangelicalism, which displays how the FBI's construction of the modern security state gave rise to white evangelical conservatism. Scholars have long noted how Hoover's FBI surveilled and antagonized clergy and faith communities, but the Bureau's embrace and endorsement of faith are not well known. Drawing on thousands of declassified FBI documents and interviews with retired special agents, Martin explains why white evangelicals rose in the halls of power and shines a light on how the religious movement became a political force that has shaped our current politics. Martin's lectures on the intersection of religion and politics in American life have been featured at national conferences, faith communities, and leading universities including Princeton, Yale, Dartmouth, Stanford, and Georgetown. His commentary and writing have appeared in popular national media outlets, including The Today Show, CNN, PBS, The Guardian, The New York Times, The Washington Post, The Boston Globe, and NPR. Martin earned his BA from Anderson University and his Master of Divinity degree from Princeton Theological Seminary before completing his PhD at Emory University in 2011. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Lerone Martin.
Thanks for being patient. This is our first time doing it like this, so. we are going to change the way in which we're doing this. Thank you for being flexible. Here he is.
Hey, my apologies. I didn't realize I was live, everyone. Well, thank you for having me. It is good to, I can't see everyone, but it is really good. Oh, audio troubles. Testing, testing, 1, 2, 3. Can you let me know how the audio is? Okay. Well, it's good to be with you all again. Um, it's an example of Zoom and the troubles with Zoom. And if I were just there with you in person, we wouldn't have this problem. But it's good to virtually be back in Indiana, and hopefully we can see each other in person at some point soon. I say back in Indiana because I'm originally from Ohio. Don't blame me at all. Don't hold it against me that I'm a Buckeye. But I went to college in Indiana. I went to college a couple hours up the road from you in Anderson. I went to Anderson University and knew a couple classmates from the Evansville area. So it's good to at least virtually be back in Indiana. And I want to thank Ron Shelby for this wonderful opportunity to share with you all. And I'm so excited for you there at the University of Evansville with the dedication of your Center for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. That's a huge accomplishment. I've been reading about you all and all that you've been doing, including the march, which was similar to Selma to Montgomery, and all the work you've been doing to make your campus a more inclusive space. So my admiration, congratulations, and respect to Ron and the university leadership for all that you all are doing. So I would just get started with our conversation for today. And I want to talk about just today MLK, the man, the minister, and the mission and the myth. In honor of Reverend King being a Baptist minister, I thought it would be appropriate to have a couple points and make sure that those points had alliteration to them. So Martin Luther King, starting off with the man. Many of you may know that King was born in January 15th, 1929. We just would have celebrated his 93rd birthday. And King was born in Indiana. His father, Martin Luther King Sr., was a minister, and King would describe his childhood as something that was born with a bow wrapped around it, that his life was a bow. And he had a very good life, one of the best lives an African American at that time in this country could have had. They had a house on Auburn Avenue. His father was one of the highest paid ministers in the entire city. And giving segregation in the South, being a minister was one of the finest occupations one could have. And so King grew up in a very, I would say, privileged environment, at least from the perspective of being an African American. And many of you know that he was a sort of a stocky fellow. He tried his hand at sports. He played baseball, he played football. His main love, according to some of his friends, was basketball. And being in Indiana, I'm sure you all can appreciate that. And as a young man playing basketball growing up, King gained the nickname of Will Shoot, meaning that if the scouting report said that if he has the ball, he will shoot. And so King, his nickname was Will Shoot. And he came off the bench for a couple of basketball teams in his young life in the elementary school moving forward. As King got to college, as he got to Morehouse, he was a part of Morehouse's early admissions program, where he tested into Morehouse College at a very young age, around the age of 15. And so when he got to Morehouse, he played on the intramural team called the Morehouse City Slickers. And there, as his height became more apparent that it would be a hindrance to him being a basketball star, being a shooter, he became much more of a facilitator, much more of someone who, a point guard who would set up his teammates to make sure that they got an opportunity to get their shots. And that is really a pivotal point for King. And as we move from man, we move from that to minister, that by the time King had gotten to Morehouse and gotten into his studies, King had decided that the ministry would be the place and the path that he would pursue to help his fellow man and fellow woman and fellow human beings. And for King, as he got into the ministry, got into his classes preparing for ministry, is when we start to see a young Martin Luther King really begin to start reaching out to people and writing about equality and writing about justice. When a man by the name of Maceo Spear was lynched and murdered in rural Georgia for voting, for being the first African-American man to vote, young Martin Luther King wrote a letter to the editor in Atlanta talking about this travesty, this injustice that a man was murdered just for voting, and how that this was not the America he wanted to live in. And so as a young man taking classes, he was not the best student originally. He was around a C student. If you read as we have here at the Martin Luther King Education Institute, we have some of his papers, some of the early recommendation letters that some of his professors wrote in evaluations. He wasn't the best student originally until he really found his passion. There was nothing really that gained the attention of some of his professors, except for his speaking ability. And most of you have heard King and his amazing speaking ability. So as King pursues the ministry, he ends up going off to seminary at Crozier Seminary in Pennsylvania, and then on to Boston University, where he did his PhD. And from there, after he finished his PhD, it's where he met his wife, Coretta, and they began to date. And Coretta has always said that she was not all that impressed with Martin Luther King, that when they met, they were introduced, and she said that he was short, and she was not too impressed with him. She thought he looked like a boy. And eventually he won her over by some of his romantic gestures toward her. And together they decide to marry, and King is considering staying in Boston and pastoring a church in Boston. All his professors thought he should stay in the North and pastor more of an elite church there, high steeple church. But King decides to go back to the South to minister to African Americans in the condition that he's very familiar with. And so as a minister, Martin King goes to the South and starts pastoring the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. And this is where we start to see King develop his theology and his ideas. And as you all have titled your event about his faith, his commitment to faith, and how that faith becomes the core of his mission. And for Martin Luther King, if we're going to understand any of his mission before we get to the point about mission, we have to understand first and foremost that King's ministry, his idea, his theology is really the core of what sets King up for his life and his mission. And when we talk about Martin Luther King, if we don't mention the fact that first and foremost, that King is a minister, that he is Reverend Martin Luther King, we really miss the whole basis of his faith. We really miss the whole foundation from which he pursues justice and equality. And what is that? So for Martin King, to understand him, the first aspect of his theology we have to understand is the Imago Dei. That is that every human being is born in the image of God. That is what the crux of King's theology that he begins with. And that every human being, despite sin in the world, despite injustice in the world, every human being is made in the image of God. And therefore, every human being is valuable and should be treated equally and accordingly. So for Martin King, from this basis, right, you can see how racism for King becomes a sin for King, right? Because for King, he says that racism is a myth. It's a made-up idea. It's not inevitable. It's a myth. It's a logic, right, that says that one group of people, because of the color of their skin, or because of the way they look, or because of their ethnicity, or because of their faith or their religion, is superior to another group of people. So for Martin Luther King, that's sin. He says plain out that what it does is it allows the discriminator or the segregator to have a false sense of superiority, right? And it imbues or enforces upon the segregated that they are somehow less than, that they are not made in the image of God. So for King, this is a sin because it causes one, it dehumanizes human beings. It doesn't allow for human flourishing. And it forces one to believe that we are not equal. So therefore, for King, racism is not just a preference. It's not just something that happens in interpersonal relationships, but it is actually a sin, both individually and corporately, and as well as within law. It is sinful. So as a minister, this is how King understands racism in America. And this is really at the core of his theological formation that he gets from going to seminary, and as he gets from going to do his PhD, and what he gets from the Black church tradition. As I mentioned, his father was a minister. So from his father, he gets his gifted oratory, his ability to preach, his homiletical skills that he has. Right? He picks this up from the Black church tradition. This is where you get when King speaks, the way he uses repetition, the way that he uses his voice modulation, the way his sermons typically start really low and then end with a crescendo at the end. So the way that he expresses this faith of the Imago Dei, this is all shaped by the Black church tradition. It expresses it through the Black church tradition. And this is what comes into the making of a Martin Luther King, right? What comes into the making of the minister of Reverend Martin Luther King. And so we have from there, what King does from there is he engages in his mission. And many of us know what the mission is, but for King, and this was the tagline of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, King's organization. For King, the mission is to redeem the soul of America. To redeem the soul of America. This is what King sees as his mission. As a minister, he believes this is his mission, right? And most of King's expression that he does this through, how he approaches it, we could call it a progressive Jeremiah, okay? And so what a Jeremiad is a form of religious and political speech that typically bemoans, right, current conditions, right, and then begins to look to answers to how to fix those current conditions, or looks to what are the problems that have come about to create these conditions. And there is a danger, if these conditions are not fixed, that God's judgment will be upon America or upon the nation for its sins if it does not repent and fix its ways. Now, this Jeremiad is often only thought about in terms of what's called a traditional Jeremiad, where someone will say, look at a particular incident in America and say, well, the reason why we have the rise in shootings is because America has turned its back on God. And if America can only go back and claim how America used to be, or the olden days, the good old days, then things are just going to get worse and God's going to continue to punish America. That's a traditional Jeremiad. But what King offered us was a progressive Jeremiad, which said that America has fallen short, and that America's current practices of discrimination, of injustice, of inequality, of racism, right? That this is actually rooted in its failure to be committed to its ideals that have been laid out in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. So for King, his Jeremiad was always about moving forward, progressing to the promise of the Declaration of Independence, progressing to the promise of the Constitution of the United States, progressing to the promise that is laid out in Scripture about all of us being created in the image of God. So King takes this idea to redeem the soul of America in a progressive Jeremiad. If you listen to his speeches, you listen to those that are well-known, those are not well-known, it's always shaped in this progressive Jeremiad, and it always comes back to the Bible and also American ideals of freedom, the land of the free, the home of the brave, the land land of milk and honey, where everyone has an opportunity. For King, he's trying to push America in that direction, to actually redeem the soul of America, to make America true to what it said on paper. And in King's ideas in this, it involves both the individual, right? His faith says it involves both the individual and the law. Now, King understood very well that you needed both, right? He was a minister. He believed in preaching to individual hearts and minds. He believed in that. What many would associate today with the evangelical movement, the idea that people need to be regenerated, to use that theological term, or need to give their lives to Jesus, or to become saved or converted, right? King was a minister. He believed in that, right? He doesn't always get credit for that. But he said in a speech here in 1967 at Stanford University, where he believed in that. He believed that individual hearts and minds needed to be transformed. He understood that. He understood that because he said the only way we are really going to produce a society that is invested in love and loving one another was not simply going to be because it was the law, right? To treat women or people of a different sexuality or a different race or whatever minoritized group, to treat them fairly. The way to do that was not simply going to be through the law, that it was going to be through changed hearts and minds, right? That we have to actually do it because it's right, not simply because they're being forced to. But he also knew that law, or structure for our sociologists in the audience, right? That structure, right, shaped human behavior. So we understood both that we needed individual commitments, but we also needed law, right? And King would say he understood full well that this type of morality, to treat one another equally, could not be legislated, right? But he said, and this is, I like how he says it, he says, but behavior can be regulated, right? He said that he understood that the law couldn't change hearts, but it could restrain the heartless from engaging in violent behavior. He said he understood that the law couldn't force a man to love him, but he could stop him from lynching him. And he also understood that the law couldn't change hearts, but it could change habits. And so for King, his ministry was also aimed at changing the law and changing laws and policies, because he really believed that it could restrain evil behavior And it could begin to change habits. And once one's habits are changed, then one's behavior would follow, one's attitudes would follow, right? So this leads us into his mission of why he engages in some of the protests that he engages in, because he's trying to change habits around, right, around, particularly around spaces of public consumption, right? Buses, right? Lunch counters, right? Voting, places of this nature. He believed that if we could change people's habits through the law, that their hearts and attitudes would follow. And so King's thrust into this leadership role and his mission in 1955 on the national scene, right? He is 26 years old, 1955. He is finishing his dissertation. Shout out to all my graduate students working on thesis and dissertations. King is working on his dissertation. He's pastoring a church. He's a young father, 1955. And he comes to Montgomery, who at a church, Dexter Avenue, which had previously gotten rid of its minister prior to King because they thought he was too politically active. And here's a young 26-year-old Martin Luther King trying to write his dissertation. And Rosa Parks and the Women's Political Council had been so active in the community already. NAACP had been active. Many people had already protested on the bus and the discrimination they were facing on the buses, being forced to sit in the back, being forced to stand, even though they paid the same fare, being forced to stand and give up their seats to white women, regardless of age. And so Rosa Parks, and before that, Claudette Colvin was a young teenage girl who had also refused to give up her seat on the bus and had fought to keep her seat, and was arrested and was struck by a police officer. But it's not until Rosa Parks, who was committed, plugged into the community, NAACP, and she does so nonviolently, that the community decides to rally around Rosa Parks and to use Rosa Parks as the symbol to engage in the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955. And the movement decides it needs a leader. And it decides that the new guy in town, Martin Luther King Jr., who doesn't have ties to the community in the same way some of the other ministers and leaders do. He's not teaching at Alabama State University, which is where most of the African-American professors taught at the time because of segregation in colleges. He's not dependent upon the state legislature for his salary. He's in a volunteer organization known as the church. And so he's chosen as the spokesperson for this movement. And this is when King is thrust into the public spotlight and helps to organize a nonviolent movement. Originally, King, all historical accounts say that originally, because of the threats upon his life, even though he was leading a nonviolent movement, King decided at the time actually to have armed men protecting his house. And it's Baird Rustin who comes along and comes down to to Montgomery, Alabama, and visits Martin Luther King. And he's the one that begins to tell Martin, if you're going to lead a nonviolent movement, right, it can't just be a tactic. And this is important for King's mission. The nonviolence can't just be a tactic. The nonviolence has to be a lifestyle. So it's not a tactic that you can use when it's useful and you can disregard when it's not useful or when it's efficacious or it's effective. For Martin Luther King, nonviolence becomes a lifestyle. It is something that you're always committed to. No matter what the situation for King, it's always nonviolence. And so from there, King launches his public mission there. The Montgomery bus boycott goes on for over a year. They organize in a world before Uber, before cell phones, before being able to tweet. These folks in 1955 in Montgomery used old school mimeograph machines and made copies of bulletins and announcements and passed them out in the community. The Women's Political Council does all this work. And they're able to, after over a year of largely the entire community cooperating and not riding the bus, they're able to get the state to overturn the discrimination that is being experienced by African Americans on the buses. And King then begins to be thrust into the national spotlight. One of King's next great movements that we know about, he had others, some that were not as successful, that did not pan out. One that sticks out is in Albany, Georgia in the early 1960s. But King really becomes, and many of the images that we're familiar with of King's mission and the mission of those who worked with him is 1963 Birmingham, Alabama. And this is the movement where many of us are familiar with the pictures of the water hoses and the dogs and of all the images that we know that have become so associated with the civil rights movement today. And King, from there, takes on this mission. He attacks Birmingham, and the plan is the issues there in Birmingham are simple, in that the lunch counters are segregated. African Americans are not allowed to eat at the lunch counters. They have to pay for their food and sometimes retrieve it around back out of the kitchen. They can't sit at the lunch counters. There are no African Americans employed in the downtown stores in Birmingham, despite the fact that African Americans go and paid the same prices for things in Birmingham. African Americans were not allowed to try on clothes in many of the stores, despite the fact that they would buy them and pay full price for them or sometimes pay more for them. And so King is invited to Birmingham in 1963 for what's called Project C, for confrontation. And this is where Martin Luther King begins to lay out the letter from Birmingham jail, which if you haven't read it, please read it. It is an exquisite sample or exquisite treatise, I would say, actually, of laying out his approaches to nonviolent protest. And King marches there. He is arrested for marching without a permit, which was obviously something that King saw was unjust, to try to stop the marches. While he is in Birmingham in jail, he writes the letter from Birmingham jail. And during this process, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference marches the Children's March. And this is where they go and get school-age children, students who are younger than college students, elementary school and high school. And they're recruited and they march and they fill up the jail cells, and they really bring the situation in Birmingham to a crisis. And this is where we know that Martin Luther King has one of his most outstanding and well-known victories is in Birmingham. The jails are filled up. They have a cooling off period of negotiation where the lunch counters are integrated. Eventually, there was an employment program that is started where African Americans are hired in the downtown stores, and as well as any discrimination that was occurring in the public sector in Birmingham was all eventually overturned. Probably the next well-known campaign of King and his mission is 1965, the March from Selma to Montgomery for voting rights, something that is in the news right now, obviously, that's so important, thinking about voting rights. And that is the moment where one of the last great marches of the civil rights movement in terms of faith communities, where brothers and sisters like Rabbi Israel Dressner and others who are from other faiths, Catholic nuns, as I mentioned, Jewish rabbis, white Protestant clergy, white Catholic clergy, all come together and march from Selma to Montgomery, a march to which you also beautifully have commemorated in your community, to help push for voting rights, to help push Congress and President Johnson to pass the voting rights bill, which led to some of the greatest voting legislation in this country. And we could arguably say that that is the moment, the brief moment, finally, where America truly became a multiracial democracy, that everyone had the right to vote. And the numbers of people who were able to vote in this country who are people of color increased dramatically as a result of the Voting Rights Act. This is some of King's these are that I've laid out, some of King's most prominent missions that he engaged in, that we know about. But for King, engaging in these marches against race and racism, for King, that was what he said, a fight for decency. that African Americans no longer had to go through life being discriminated against simply because of the color of their skin, being told that somehow they're not as smart, being told somehow they're not as clean, they're not as attractive, they're not as worthy, they're not made in the image of God. For King, these fights were about a fight for decency. But for King to move from a fight for decency to a fight for equality meant so much more. It meant so much more. And for King, and this is something that we always have to remember about Martin Luther King today, and that gets lost, is that there were other aspects to his mission. It wasn't just about racism. So for King, in order to get to equality, you had to include two other vital aspects. And one of those was poverty. Martin Luther King was concerned about poverty and concerned about ending poverty in this country. And for King, engaging in a fight against poverty, that was the beginning of really achieving true equality. Fighting against legalized racism, right? That's the fight for decency. Fighting for and against poverty. That's when the fight for equality really began. And King has always been concerned about this, right? One of the things that I mentioned that most of us are familiar with, that I failed to mention in 1963 is the March on Washington. That's where we have the I Have a Dream speech, right? And that speech, the one line on that speech that many of us are familiar with, right? That I have a dream one day, or I have a dream that my children will be judged by, not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. That part is often played on throughout our media sources. It's tweeted about, it's talked about, but that march itself was called the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, because King was concerned about poverty. He was concerned about labor. He was concerned about working people. And the idea that you could have a civil rights movement that just simply focused on race, King didn't think that that was full. It had to be also about poverty, and had to also be about those who are working and not receiving a livable wage. And so for Martin King, it's the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. And if you listen to that speech, he's talking about that. He talks about America has given African Americans a promissory note, right? That and the African Americans have gone to cash the check. And the check of democracy says there's insufficient funds. But we refuse to believe that the bank of democracy is bankrupt, right? He talks about the African American living on an island of poverty, right? And a land full of resources. And so for Martin King, his concerns about poverty are connected in many ways to racism, right? About how racism oftentimes can contribute to poverty. Right, where we continue to have discrimination, so that a group of people are set off to the side. Anytime our white brothers and sisters who are laboring try to push for labor rights and push for a livable wage, the captains of industry could always say, hey, well, we'll fire you. If you want to leave, we'll fire you and go hire African Americans who have been locked out, who don't have a chance to gain wealth and have a livable wage and decency. So for King, race and poverty were always linked together. And he always believed that we had to always fight against our concerns about poverty. And most of King's mission, in interesting ways, is bookended by this concern. 1963, March on Washington, right? Where he says, again, as I mentioned, the March for Jobs and Freedom. 1955, Montgomery bus boycott. The people in Montgomery who had cars weren't concerned about the buses. Those who worked at Alabama State University, the professors, those who had money, there were African Americans who could purchase cars. The people who were riding the bus were people who couldn't afford a car. So we was always concerned about this. And of course, we know the famous speech in 1968 in Memphis, right? That I've been to the mountaintop speech. Why is Martin King in Memphis? Martin King is in Memphis because he's marching with sanitation workers. Right? He's marching with sanitation workers, two of which had recently been murdered and literally crushed by the trash compactor truck because they didn't have safety on the job. They didn't have a livable wage. They didn't have health insurance. They didn't have the things that they needed to have a decent life. King was there because he was asked to come there to participate in the march in Memphis for sanitation workers. And when he's murdered, he's putting together a poor people's campaign, something that has been reinvigorated by Reverend Barber and Reverend Theo Harris and others in this country. King was trying to put together a multiracial organization to march on Washington and camp out on Washington until they passed appropriate poverty legislation that would allow people to work jobs so they could have decent housing. Legislation he believed that would help was universal basic income. All of these things we are still talking about today in our politics. And these are things that King was saying in the 60s. The final thing for King, and this is what rounded out his mission, this is what he said was the third of the evil triplets, he liked to call them. So he was concerned about race. That was the first evil triplet, the first of the triplets. Poverty was the second evil triplet. And then King said the third, which was about militarism, right? King was concerned about war. And in 1967, and April 4th, 1967, literally a year before he is assassinated, he gave us a famous address at Riverside Church in New York City about a time to break silence. And he expressed why that he was opposed to the Vietnam War. Now, many people have said to Martin King, what are you doing? Stick to civil rights. This is not your concern. Stick to civil rights. And his popularity dramatically decreases. But for King, war was part of civil rights. For King, what he saw was that the war in Vietnam, and he says this in A Time to Break Silence, if you haven't read the speech, he says that part of the reason why he's concerned about this is, number one, that the war on poverty in this country, he said, was not a real war on poverty. It was barely a skirmish, he said, because of all the money that was being spent on Vietnam. So he has a financial concern that there's only so much money around, and the United States has decided to fight a war in Vietnam. And he says, and then decide to pay millions of dollars to put a man on the moon when it refuses to spend money here so that men and women can have just place their feet on solid earth right here in this country. So for Martin King, it's a financial concern that the military industrial complex, something that President Eisenhower told us to be concerned about, the military industrial complex, that money that's being spent for that could be diverted for poverty programs. So he's concerned about that when it comes to war. He's also concerned about the loss of life, that war always brings with it the loss of life. And for King, no matter if you were in America or no matter if you were across the world in another country, at this time would have been Vietnam, in Asia, it didn't matter. You were made in the image of God. And so to lose a human life like this was for King was just the greatest of sins. So he was against war because of that. And he's also against war because of the way that the draft at the time, the conscription services, the way that it was predicated in preying upon the poor and people of color. Those who had resources were able to get out of the draft, but those who couldn't went and fought. And for King, it was disproportionately African Americans and those who were poor. And King said they are over on the other side of the world fighting for a democracy that they don't even enjoy right here in the United States. He said that here they are fighting shoulder to shoulder with African Americans, fighting shoulder to shoulder with their white brothers and sisters, and they couldn't even attend the same schools in America. King said there's something wrong with that. And so these were the three things that King was concerned about. And if you listen to his speeches and go back, you'll hear them. You'll hear even the March on Washington, where he talks about concerned about militarized police or police brutality, right? So even in his early addresses, he's concerned about these things. He's concerned about how all of these things come together, right? And how they hinder America from fulfilling its promise. And all of this mission, his concern about racism, his concern about poverty, his concern about militarism. It put him dead center in the scope of the FBI. Martin Luther King was the target of FBI surveillance and harassment for at least the last 5 years of his life, from 1963 to 1968. Martin Luther King was subject to having his home bugged, his office bugged, having informants be paid by the FBI to supply them with information. His life was constantly harassed and surveilled because of these three things. Because he believed that America was a racist country that needed to be fixed. Because he believed America was a country that allowed for poverty when it didn't have to, when it had the resources and it had the money and the know-how and the technology to end poverty. And because he fought against war and he believed that war was wrong. King was a target of FBI surveillance as a result. The FBI, J. Edgar Hoover in particular, believed that King was a communist, despite the fact that the investigation originally, prior to this March on Washington, had said that communists were not controlling the civil rights movement, that King and others had too much of a religious commitment to be communist. Yes, King believed in a universal basic income. Yes, King questioned the ideas of certain things being turned over to the free market, like water and education and electricity. He questioned those things. But it was very clear that he was not a communist. King always said that the problem was that communism forgot that life was individual. But he said the problem with capitalism forgot that life was also social. So for King, the answer was not in capitalism or communism, right? But it was something of a synthesis in the middle. But yet the FBI believed that that King was a committed communist who was bent on overthrowing the government, and he was an atheist, and that his ministerial or clerical robes was nothing but a disguise for a more sinister plot against America. So the FBI paid for informants to give them information. They bugged his hotel rooms. They believed that they caught Martin Luther King engaged in extramarital affairs and sent supposedly a tape. Many of you saw this in the movie Selma. Put together a tape, a reel of King in a hotel room, supposedly Martin Luther King, with someone who was not his wife. They had other ministers, including Elder Lightfoot Solomon Mashal, who was the first minister, black or white, to have his own television show. They gave him information a lot so that he could launder information in some of his sermons to claim that Martin Luther King was a communist or that he was bad for America. But yet in all of this, this burrowing into King's life, this burrowing into this life, right? The FBI never once brought criminal charges against Martin Luther King. 5 years of burrowing into his life and stalking him and surveilling him. Not once did they bring criminal charges up against Martin Luther King, but yet they continued to pursue him as someone who was a major national security threat. And so King, because of his commitments and because of his war against racism and war against poverty and warring against militarism, he became the public enemy number one in many ways until the day he was assassinated on April 4th of 1968. Now, in the little time we have left before we go to questions, I want to address the myth. So I've gone through the man. We've gone through his theological foundations as a minister. We've gone through his mission. Now let's talk a little bit about the myth. And that is, I believe that there are 5 ways, and I'll be quick about this. I believe there are 5 ways in which America engages in public conversations, engage in a mythology of Martin Luther King. And I think this is important because if we can narrow the scope of King, if we can narrow his legacy, if we can narrow who he really was and shorten who he was, right, then we can limit King to I Have a Dream speech, to talk about legalized racism, right? And then we can say, look, King was here and he solved that problem. If we limit his legacy, engage in a mythos, right? Then what it allows us to do, it allows us to dismiss anything that comes outside of that legacy. So anytime we have a protest organization pushing for something in this country that says it has somehow it's racialized, right? That there's some injustice in this country that's based on race. If we can engage in the mythology of Martin Luther King, then we can dismiss the claims of any current protest. And it also can blind us to any current injustice that's going on in this country today. So what are these 5 myths? And I'll make them short. I think there are 5 myths that we can think about, and all of them, I think, conveniently start with the letter C. The first, I believe, is that America's commitment to Martin Luther King has been consistent. Right? That's just not true. King, as I've just pointed out, was public enemy number 1 in terms of domestic security. The FBI writes a memo that says that he is the most dangerous, at the time they used the word Negro, the most dangerous Negro in the country. America was not always committed to King and to King's dreams. We know we have the March on Washington, which people love to play, which is a tremendous moment. It's a beautiful speech. No one can preach like Martin Luther King. But we have to realize that that was simultaneously the height of his popularity in this country and also the beginning of the end. Once King began to expand his concerns to things like poverty and war, his popularity went down. For example, when King went to Chicago in 1966 and started marching for open housing so that African Americans could live anywhere they could afford to live, that they would stop having real estate agencies steer African Americans to only to all Black neighborhoods and allowing white brothers and sisters to have some of the better housing in some of the suburbs and small neighborhoods in Chicago. When King goes on that march, he gets no help from the federal government. When King goes on that march, there are whole, quote unquote, middle class communities, husbands and wives and children and girlfriends and boyfriends and children and grandmothers and grandfathers are all out protesting Martin Luther King. The man who previously had been Man of the Year, Nobel Peace Prize winner, was being protested and rocks were being thrown at him in Chicago for marching for open housing. When he came out against the Vietnam War, he immediately becomes public enemy number 1 and is no longer invited to the White House to speak. And it took into the 80s, it took 15 years for America to finally give Martin Luther King the holiday that he has right now. Ronald Reagan originally had said he was going to, that he would oppose it, that he would veto it. And eventually he signed the holiday. But not until he could minimize King's commitments to minimize those. And one of the ways that Ronald Reagan did that, and this is the second C, is the colorblind. That Ronald Reagan tried to make King's dream simply about freedom. When he signed the King holiday into law, he said Martin Luther King believed that everybody should be free and to pursue their potential. And that's why I came to Washington. That's not the real full message of Martin Luther King. So we have to be careful that we don't fall into the trap of thinking that all that King fought for was colorblindness. Yes, Martin Luther King believed in wanted a world where his children could play with white children. He wanted a world where people would be judged by the color of their skin and not the content of their character. Yes, he believed in those things, but he also believed that we had to have structural change. And if we simply say, let's stop talking about race, let's not talk about color, let's not judge people based on color, let's just judge them based on their abilities. Well, then we have to ask the question, who gets to decide who's capable? Who gets to decide who's qualified? And often it's going to be the status quo. And so if we say, let's not look at race anymore, let's only look at ability, well, who's doing the judgment? Who's doing the assessing of that? So yes, King wanted his children and wanted us to live in a world where Black and white and brown and yellow and red could all live together. But it was very clear that we also needed to be vigilant to how our structures in our society, oftentimes, if left alone, will defer to the status quo. And we all know that has been white supremacy. So for King, we always have to be concerned about structure and making sure that we have structures in place, right, that don't continue to allow certain types of inequality, right, to persist under the guise of being colorblind. The second is this idea that Martin King, right, is a icon for protesting anything that we don't like. And I'm sorry for any football fans out there. I'm going to talk a little bit. If we have any Green Bay Packers fans in the house, I apologize in advance. I can't see you, so if you're booing me or putting your thumbs down, then that's okay. But Aaron Rodgers provides, in my opinion, a great example of this idea how Martin Luther King becomes this icon for anything that we don't like. So many of you know the story. The quarterback, Aaron Rodgers, decided that he didn't want to be vaccinated. And he kind of was a bit unclear about his vaccination status. That is besides the point. What was the point is that he said, the great MLK said that you have to stand up for injustice. Martin Luther King had a very clear rubric by which how we challenge laws, but also how he believed that we could determine if a law was unjust. So just citing Martin Luther King as being the icon of anything we want to challenge, that's not appropriate, right? That's part of a myth. For King, you're able to judge if a law is unjust if it doesn't square with the law of the natural universe, King would say, if it doesn't allow for human flourishing. And also, if it's a law, especially as it relates to our politics, that is put in place by the majority without input from a minority, right? So we're thinking about voting. If we have legislation that's put in place and a whole group of people are stopped from voting, King would say that that's an unjust law. But it was also an unjust law is a law that the majority inflicts upon a minority, but doesn't hold itself accountable for the same law, right? So for King, there's a rubric by which we can say a law is unjust, right? So to simply throw out Martin King's name anytime there's something we don't like is creating part of the myth, the mythology of Martin Luther King. Second, he had a rubric about how one goes about protesting. We all know for King it was nonviolent, but for King, you first had to do a collection of facts to see if an injustice was there. Second, you had to engage in direct negotiations. And if those break down, third, you go through a period of self-purification. If you're going to be in a nonviolent protest, making sure that you're prepared to not strike back if you are struck. And finally, to engage in open nonviolent protest and be willing to accept the consequences of the protest. There's no hiding. There's no being very cryptic about one's meaning. If you oppose something, you oppose it openly and nonviolently and willingly accept the consequences. That's King's rubric for how to challenge laws we think are unjust. He's not simply the icon for anything that we decide we don't like. All right, fourth, that King was somehow not involved in controversy. Many people confuse King's way and say that, Martin Luther King would have never marched down the highway. Martin Luther King would have never shut down a bridge. That's not the King that history tells us existed. The Birmingham campaign purposely was launched on Easter weekend where there'd be a lot of shopping for purposeful because he wanted to be able to make sure that people would be perturbed and confronted with the segregation of the era. King was all about what he called a creative tension. He wanted things to be tense so that, right, you could confront the issue and it couldn't be avoided, right? That's why this idea that there is appropriate time to protest, right? You shouldn't be protesting on the football field. You shouldn't be protesting in front of this restaurant. Protest for King was all about a creative tension, right? He wanted the tension to be there. Right. And King said what we find in this country often is that people are more in love with what he would say order than they are about justice. So for King, you create tension to force people to deal with the issue, a creative tension, not to embarrass the oppressor, not to embarrass those in power, but to try to bring them to the table to negotiate. Right. So I think when people think that King was non-controversial, they get confused. They think because he was nonviolent that he was passive and meek and mild, but that's not true. King was all about making creative tension. And finally, I think the thing that we have to be mindful of in the mythos of Martin Luther King is concern about consumption. Every year we find that somehow that we're told that in order to celebrate Martin Luther King, that it involves somehow turning us to the marketplace, somehow turning us to shopping or buying something. And I think we all have to be very, very, very leery of this and be concerned about this, right? That King's own legacy tells us to always be mindful about how this idea of the free market, right, can be very dangerous for us. In King's last sermon at Ebenezer Baptist Church on February 4th of 1968, it's his last sermon at Ebenezer Baptist Church. And King preaches a sermon that called the drum major instinct. And King says in this sermon that all of us have a drum major instinct. He's using psychology to say that all of us have this innate desire to be out in front, to be praised, to be recognized, to lead the parade. And King says that advertisers, right, marketing pitches to this. Right? You have to wear these types of clothes in order to be noticed. You have to wear this cologne in order to feel attractive, or wear this lipstick to get the attention of a potential romantic suitor. You have to drive this kind of car and live this kind of house because it fits the desire or helps to appease this drum major instinct. But King said for all of us that if we are going to have the drum major instinct, we have to harness it, or it can lead us down to debt. It can lead us down to a slippery road. And King said if we're going to harness the drum major instinct, he said in the sermon, that let it be to be a drum major for justice. That if we're going to be drum majors, let us be drum majors for justice. And he closes the sermon by preaching his own funeral. He says he thinks about it, and he says that in my own funeral, I don't want people to talk about how many awards I've won or how many degrees that I have or how many speeches I've given. Let them say that I was a drum major for justice. And that's how I'll end our time before we go to questions, that I would challenge all of us that on the Martin Luther King holiday, let us remember his mission, that it came from his enduring faith, and that at the end of the day, if we're going to be anything, let us all do our best to try to be nonviolent drum majors for justice. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to the questions.
If there are any questions, I have a microphone here, and we have a way to be able to get this done. So if you have any questions, I'll have to have you talk into the mic, and we're actually going to chat with him so he can respond. Yes.
God bless you. Enjoy the presentation. I just had one question. Having had the benefit of studying Dr. King and the context of Malcolm X as well, and the two philosophies, one was of basically forced integration, and the other one would be Black nationalism and allowing segregation or integration to kind of take on a more organic process, you know, and having more of a focus on the Black community itself being actualized and that type of thing, like Garveyism. So how would you kind of characterize that whole juxtaposition during the era, and then what that might mean for today as well?
So I'll read the question out for those. I don't know if everyone has access to it. Thanks for the question. Having studied MLK and Malcolm X as well, how would you characterize the juxtaposition between the era and what that means today as well? You know, I think if I understand the question correctly, I think that both Martin and Malcolm both had commitments, obviously, to justice and equality. And, you know, but they certainly had different ways of thinking about how to pursue that goal. I think for Martin, as I tried to state earlier, nonviolence was always going to be the answer. Nonviolence was the basis for him, and there was no other way that could be achieved. Malcolm believed in self-defense. Malcolm did not believe in going out and assassinating people, or he was not, despite what the FBI or others may have said, it was not a terrorist organization. He was a Black nationalist, which meant that he believed in African American communities building themselves up, and African Americans having control of their communities, their own schools, their own institutions, their own stores, and believing that African Americans needed to reclaim their heritage. But Malcolm, because of that, Malcolm believed that African American heritage had been so degraded, engaged in degradation, and a long history of oppression. Malcolm believed that nonviolence in many ways only added to that African Americans had to develop a level of self-pride and dignity. And the only way one could do that is making sure one protected one's life and property. So he just didn't believe that in Martin's ideas of nonviolence. Now, Malcolm goes from being committed in many ways to a kind of separatism that is Malcolm towards the end of his life and expands his ideas to the globe. Malcolm really does begin to get involved in politics. And as you read some of his later interviews prior to his death in 1965, he really is considering that Black and white could possibly one day live together, but he believed that African Americans needed to engage in a level of self-reclamation and engage in a level of pride and commitment and leadership together with African Americans first and foremost, before they could even think about engaging in the question of integration. And so one scholar who I really enjoy who's written on this is my dear brother, Peniel Joseph. And he describes Martin's goals as radical citizenship. And he describes Malcolm's as a radical dignity. And then Malcolm was really committed to making sure African Americans had a level of self-pride and self-respect, loving themselves, loving their dark skin, not judging everything by Eurocentric norms. And so those, in that regard, they had similar goals for sure. And had Malcolm lived longer, I don't think Malcolm ever would have been given over to nonviolence, but I do think he would have considered engaging with Martin along the lines of voting and getting political power in this country. And I think they could have come together on that.
Questions? Try to keep the question succinct because she's got to type it.
What is the new book by Peniel Joseph about Malcolm and Dr. King? I'm sorry I don't have that note with me today. I know his book was just announced today in this area.
What is his new book? It's Peniel Joseph, and the book is called The Sword and the Shield. Martin Luther King and Malcolm X is the name of the book. And he plays with the theme about who is the sword and who is the shield with Martin and Malcolm. But his thesis is that King gives us a radical citizenship and Malcolm gives us a radical Black dignity. The sword and the shield.
Knowing what you
As you get ready to bring the last question up, Rob, I just want to thank you again for the opportunity to share with you all, University of Evansville, and I'm just really impressed and thrilled and excited about the work that's going on there, and so happy that I have had opportunity, even virtually, just to be a part of the celebration. So I want to thank you again as we ready for the last question.
Knowing what you know today about all the
I wish I was there with you for your reception.
voting
Man, the reception sounds like it was going to be amazing.
knowing what you know about today's states that are changing the voting laws, do you think that Martin Luther King would still believe that democracy has a chance in America?
Question is, knowing what you know about states that are changing the voting laws, do you think MLK would still believe that democracy still has a chance? This is an easy question to end on. You know, Martin said when he came here to Stanford in 1967, he said that that what was being called at the time was the white backlash at the time with the 1964 election of Barry Goldwater, and as we start to see the Republican Party begin to flip the South. Martin said that that was nothing new, and that he said that America, for the most part, had never, ever made a full commitment to the equality of people of color in its political system. And that he pointed out that every time a step was made forward, there was always a push to take several steps back. And so I think that Martin would not be surprised. I think he might be surprised that we're surprised that with the progress that has been made, whether it's the election of the first non-white president, or whether it's the election of the first woman vice president, or whether it's, you know, a host of other accomplishments that have happened in this country, I think he would be surprised that we're surprised that there has been such pushback, that those who don't believe in a multiracial democracy, or those who believe in white supremacy, that they will always engage in pushback. And so I think Martin would still have hope. I think he would say that we still have to fight for it, but I think he would say, why are you all surprised by this? And I think he would encourage us to engage in creative, nonviolent protests, to engage in creative tension, both to change the laws on the books, and also so that hopefully we could also change hearts as well. So I do think he would still say that there is a chance, for sure. And the chance starts with all of us, those of us who are individuals of goodwill, people of faith, people who believe in the Imago Dei, people believe in equality and justice, that the chance of democracy, of surviving, rests with us. I think that's what he would tell us. Thank you for having me. I wish I was there with you. I raise a glass to you all while here at Stanford, and have a wonderful time. And thank you for inviting me to be part of this wonderful celebration. I wish I could see you all, but you're with me in my heart and my mind, and I'm just so thankful for the celebration that you all are doing and all the wonderful work that Rob is doing. I just want to thank you for having me, and I hope we can meet each other in person one day. Thanks for having me.
All right. That is a first, everybody. Wow. Okay. So we do want to transition a bit. This is also the evening where we give the Mays Legacy Award, and so we want to give time for that as well. So Dr. Rose Mays was unable to be here, and she is watching online, though, and so we're going to still move forward. The Mays Legacy Award is presented annually at the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Annual Lectureship at the University of Evansville. It goes to an UE alum, or a campus member selected by the University of Evansville Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Committee. The purpose of the award is to recognize and affirm those who have made significant contributions in the areas of race relations, justice, and/or human rights. The nominees have been personally and corporately involved in making tangible, visible, and meaningful contributions to the advancement of race relations, justice, and/or human rights causes. I now invite Dr. Lisa Marie Hale to the stage to present this award.
The Reverend Veltri M. Taylor and her husband Kenneth have 2 children, Veltra K. and Kenneth. Reverend Taylor and her husband have 2 granddaughters, ages 12 years old and 13 months old. Reverend Taylor holds a Bachelor of Science degree in psychology from Jackson State University, Jackson, Mississippi, and a Master of Science degree in clinical psychology from the University of Evansville. She completed her Master of Divinity from Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary and the chaplain's residency at Deaconess Hospital's Clinical Pastoral Education Program. She was ordained in the National Baptist Convention and later in the Presbyterian Church. In 2015, Reverend Taylor became pastor of the First Ebenezer Baptist Church in Evansville, making her the first African-American female to pastor a church in the Southern District of the Indiana Baptist State Convention of the NBC. Reverend Taylor was a full-time spiritual and bereavement care counselor at AsiraCare Hospice. Reverend Taylor also serves as an adjunct and ethics instructor at Ivy Tech Community College Southwest Campus. Reverend Taylor has over 30 years experience working with developmentally disabled individuals, designing behavioral modification plans, and completing psychological evaluations and career assessments. She designed and implemented the programmatic strategy for Harvest Time Inner-City Ministries, which focuses on providing hot meals in wider Evansville, particularly in the inner city. She is a member of the National Sorority of Delta Sigma Theta, the National Sorority of Phi Delta Kappa, Psi Chi, the International Society. She is the recipient of the University of Southern Indiana's Phenomenal Woman Award for Community Involvement. She's been recognized for her religious contributions to the community by the Black Women's Task Force. Reverend Taylor is president of the Board of Directors for Patchwork Central and secretary of the Board of Directors for Indivisible Evansville. She's active in the NAACP and has served as an advisor for Bridge. Reverend Veltri Taylor is motivated to serve and love others by her Lord and Savior and Son of God, Jesus the Christ. On behalf of Dr. Rose M. Mays and the UE Martin Luther King Jr. Committee, it's my distinct honor to present the 2022 Mays Legacy Award to Reverend Veltri Taylor. Let's congratulate her.
say a few words, or you good?
I'd like to thank the committee for such a distinguished honor. And as I was sitting there thinking about what I would say, I thought, I'm glad it took a while to get the speaker going, because that took away some time, and you won't be wondering if I'm going to talk too long. I do want to say, relevant to that which our speaker presented, I'm thinking that along with everything he said, the answers to the questions that I thought were just remarkable, he pulled that stuff out of here somewhere and, gave us information that I couldn't have even begun to have even, I think, figured out. Brother over here, Reverend over here, at Hall, asked words I'd have to Google if I had time. But I want to say, along with everything he said, something that came to me is this. In order for us to have radical citizenship or radical dignity, we can't have one without the other. Looking at shield versus sword, we better not go into battle without having both. So I'd like for us to think about how can we be agents to actually make that thing come alive. How can it be such that we are drum majors, doing this thing whereby individuals can experience a radical sense of citizenship, while at the same time experiencing this remarkable sense of dignity, recognizing that you're okay and I'm okay, and we're going to do this thing together. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Oh, my goodness. You all just got a little taste, just a little taste. Oh my goodness. I'm going to ask Abigail Catania, our Assistant Director for Diversity Recruitment and Programming, to come up and talk to us about a new award that we are offering, presenting this year, called the Rising Star Award. Abigail?
Thanks, Rob. Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for being here. So I have the pleasure of introducing our new award. As Dr. Shelby mentioned, it is the Rising Star Award, and it's the Rising Star Service Award that we have instituted this year through the MLK Committee because we wanted to honor recent graduates who are going and living the legacy of MLK, not just out and about doing the thing, whether it be with work, volunteer work, whatever they're doing in the community, but living his legacy throughout their time at UE and beyond when they are done and they are continuing to be change makers and continuing that legacy. The Rising Star Service Award is a newly established award celebrating recent graduates from the University of Evansville. Award recipients have a track record of significant contribution to the campus and/or Evansville community, have showcased a commitment to leading change, and exhibit outstanding potential for continued leadership and community service. Recipients of this award reflect the goals in life of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and his passionate pursuit of social justice and equity. This year, we had a number of amazing nominees, and we just couldn't decide. So we will be honoring 2 recent alums tonight. So I'm going to ask Professor Sarah Smith to step to the stage and present the first recipient.
I'm so pleased and honored to present one of our inaugural Rising Star Awards to Jasmine Coleman, a 2021 graduate of the University of Evansville. I met Jasmine as a quiet but extremely friendly and positive first-year student, slightly obsessed with Leslie Odom Jr., during my first semester at UE, and I've had the pleasure of watching her blossom into a true leader. Jasmine is a determined and understated leader, often working behind the scenes to make change, while not scared to facilitate and lead difficult conversations with those in power to improve the condition of her BIPOC peers. As a sophomore, Jasmine was a founding member of the University of Evansville Artists of Color, an organization that was born out of crisis as a way for Black, Indigenous, and students of color to have direct conversation with faculty about their concerns. Jasmine then served as the president of the organization, working to define what the group would be as it moved into its next chapter, and to create structure and processes for the organization to earn university recognition and to self-sustain after the founding members graduated from UE. This is work that will have a lasting impact on the University of Evansville community. UET AOC defines their mission as working to aid the dismantling of racism and discrimination by empowering voices of artists of color within UE. The organization strives to cultivate a space that encourages conversations, creates advocates, and challenges social stigma by promoting positive views of racial diversity, equity, and inclusion within the department, the university, and the industry. During the turmoil of 2020 and 2021, as the world and the UE community began having often overdue conversation about equity and justice, Jasmine led listening groups with her peers, ran meetings with her faculty and university leadership with great poise and a skill beyond her years. I cried after attending the first meeting Jasmine led because I was so incredibly impressed by her poise and her leadership. Jasmine made herself available and was often called upon to mediate and help others navigate conversations, both in the theater department and on campus. Jasmine never shied away from difficult conversations or from advocating for what she believed in and what would benefit BIPOC students on campus, while being deeply committed to fostering a sense of reconciliation and working towards unity. Jasmine studied theater management at UE and exemplifies what theater and arts organizations in general need in management. A leader that is diligently working to expand access and grow diverse audiences while remaining committed to the artists that are creating the work. While at UE, Jasmine worked with the Arts Council of Southern Indiana to develop plans to reach new audience members for their programming. Jasmine and her Change Lab cohort worked to develop timelines, outreach, and marketing strategies for the organization to connect with both younger and more racially diverse audiences. This is the work that she's engaging in now as the Director of Audience Services and Development at Great River Shakespeare Festival. While Jasmine works to nurture, grow, and diversify the audience that comes to see the work Great River produces, she has also identified the need and is leading a project to partner with mental health and trauma facilities in the area for BIPOC and LGBTQ visiting artists, so that the 110 artists that are seasonally hired and moved to the small town of Winona, Minnesota, have the resources and support they need while working at Great River Shakespeare Festival. Jasmine exhibits poise, passion, and drive, and works to make positive change and foster engagement in the communities she lives and works in. Her impact on the UE community will live on through UET AOC, and while she only graduated last May, she's already creating meaningful positive change in her new community. Her belief in the possibility of making the world and her organizations better by supporting diversity through increased access, inclusion, and unity is an inspiration to me, and I'm honored to represent the MLK committee in presenting her with the inaugural Rising Star Award. Jasmine is unable to be with us today to accept the award, but she is truly honored to be a recipient, and thanks the University of Evansville and the MLK committee for the recognition.
So that's our first. We had a tie, and so the question was, what should we do? And I said, let's just give two. I know the second student. I knew Jasmine as well. I know Jasmine. And and everything that Professor Smith just said was accurate. Our second awardee actually provided her own words, and I thought I would just read them to you because I think it fully encapsulates why she was nominated. She says, "The voice holds so much power, and most of us are still afraid to use ours. Nonetheless, I have always felt like the voice is potentially our simplest yet most vital instrument to navigate life. With this tool, I have tried to live out the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who used his voice to gather thousands and inflict a change so great that I could have not only hope, but also opportunity. During Dr. King's time, opportunities such as a good education for Black people were far and wide. So he marched and preached until society would, quote unquote, allow for it. It was a long battle, but those actions have pushed me to take education so seriously. Throughout all 4 years of my college experience, I worked in the Change Lab program. Change Lab courses made me realize I could use my education as a way to share my voice. Change Lab allowed me to do many things. I know I will leave a few out, but here's an attempt to tell you a little bit. I created and issued surveys about diversity on campus, designed small STEM programs for low-income area schools, completed several trainings, and presented how to be more anti-biased. By far, though, my greatest accomplishment working with Change Lab was being a part of creating the Passport to Inclusion program that we just started this semester, by the way. Passport to Inclusion is a program implemented by 7 other college students and me to spread knowledge and create a more inclusive campus community. Even after graduating, Passport to Inclusion continues to be important at UE. After graduating, I had the opportunity of joining UE's Journey to Justice Civil Rights Bus Tour as a mentor. It was such an experience getting to visit museums and hear personal stories about Black trauma due to white privilege from the actual voices of actual heroes. After the trip, I wanted to tell stories in a way that would teach and influence minds about freedom and justice. Since graduating, I have gone on to teach at a public charter middle school located in a low-income community, the community where I grew up. I teach the kids everything I know, and in return, they teach me. Their voices are so big and so proud, and I cannot wait for others to hear them. Although I sometimes feel like I am not doing enough, with my few accomplishments, I can say that I used my voice to share the Black perspective, create hope, and be a reflection to those around me. I have used my voice to leave a legacy that invokes others to do the same one day, a legacy like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. This year's second Rising Star Award goes to Quran, also Q, Faith Johnson. And she is unable to be here with us tonight, but we will applaud anyway. Thank you all for being here. To close out the night, I'm going to ask President Petroskevich to come and give some closing remarks. And as he comes up, as you're leaving, you'll notice that there's a table right outside here with some T-shirts and things there. That is a fundraiser for the Journey to Justice program that we do here, that allows high school students to be able to go on the Civil Rights Bus Tour in the South. The shirts for this year, for the 54 miles for social change, are $15, but the ones from last year are $5. So, got to do it that way, right? And yes, we want to get rid of merchandise. So, help out if you can. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you all so much for for being here, and my job is to simply say thank you. Many of you have spent all day with us today. From the beginning of the dedication of our new Center for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion and a multicultural commons space outside, to the rally, to the panel discussion, and then ultimately to a fantastic lecture tonight that really, I want to thank the Martin Luther King Jr. Committee and the Rose Mays Selection Committee for bringing us such a wonderful talent. I can't wait to let President Pistol at Anderson College know that he has such a wonderful member of his alumni class that delivered such a great lecture for us tonight. Thanks to Mayor Winnicke for being part of our celebrations today, all day. And, you know, we know that these things don't happen by accident, that they all happen as a result of intentionality. So we don't often thank our technology staff, but I am very publicly saying thank you to our technology staff for making this work extraordinarily well today. And then finally, as we dedicated the center earlier today, we did talk about the promise and the pledge of what the university means for the future. And a big part of that is the leadership of that organization that is part of our University of Evansville community. So on behalf of all of us at the university, thanks to Dr. Rob Shelby and Abigail Catania, who are leading our Center for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, not only for their work today in putting together a wonderful program, but for the promise of the future. So thank you, Dr. Shelby, and thank you to Abigail. So on behalf of all of us, thanks for being a part of the University of Evansville as we continue to intentionally think about what the future means. So get out your wallets, get out your $5, get out your $15, go buy some shirts. Thanks for being part of the University of Evansville, everybody. Have a good night.